What's up, guys? I want to talk to you today about podcasting. Why you should do it, why you shouldn't do it. There's many reasons. I'm sure that many of you are thinking, I would love to be the host of a podcast. It could be something that builds my brand. But is it really something that's for you? Well, let's talk about it. The first thing you need to decide is, what is the reason for your podcast? Do you just want to be a podcast host so that you can meet influencers, maybe build your own personal brand? That's great. Is your goal to add podcasting as a part of your inbound marketing strategy? That's also possible. Generating leads quickly may not be the best reason to host a podcast. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. First of all, let's talk about the type of audience that you want to reach when hosting a podcast. So there's three different kinds of ways that you can reach people. You can reach people through video, you can reach people through audio, or you can reach people through text. Now, you could very simply write a blog, let that blog get registered with Google, improve your SEO through writing. But there's some people that don't really like to sit down and read, especially long form content. There's only so many people that are interested in reading an ebook that might take an hour, right? YouTube videos, it's great, but not everybody's out on YouTube searching for content every day, okay? There's a lot of people that like to watch videos, but there's other people that find it, a little bit too time consuming also to sit down for 30 minutes or an hour to watch a full video. It's also difficult to create an hour-long video that's really engaging. Let's talk about the third type of person, the podcast listener. This is somebody who, they probably watch plenty of videos, they probably also read plenty of blogs, but there's that gap where they find that somewhere in their life they can also consume a lot of audio content as well. For me, I listen to podcasts, and I just so happen to do it mostly when I'm at the gym. Why? Because obviously I'm not watching videos, I'm too engaged, like working out, maybe walking on the treadmill. It's just a quick way for me to, during my 1 hour workout, to learn something new by listening to a 1 hour podcast. Okay, so this is the type of audience that we're trying to reach when we create a podcast. People that they're probably already consuming your content through blogging and through videos, but we're capturing their attention through a whole other method. That is the point of a podcast. Not to be a standalone tool to bring in new leads and visitors, but to be an additional media entity that augments your current process. So let's talk about expectations a little bit. Will you generate leads tomorrow with a podcast? No, it's not going to happen. If you're thinking about creating a podcast, it must be a part of a long-term strategy for you. Now, the second thing to consider is, how much is your product worth? Maybe you're a services company and you are selling some service that's $5,000 a month. Maybe you're selling some kind of hardware, which if you get a new client, a new customer, perhaps that's worth $50,000 a month. I would say for you, a podcast is something that would be very, very good to implement if you do it properly, to engage users, because in that sense, the cost of creating a podcast versus the potential revenue balances quite nicely. If you can make $50,000 a month, or even $10,000 a month from one customer, then that warrants putting the time and the resources together to start a podcast. However, if your product is something that's only $10 a month or $20 a month, and your sales cycle is still pretty long, you will still be able to make revenue from a podcast, but you'll have to expect that it's going to be a long game for you. I'm talking like return on investment after 3, 4, or 5 years. You have to be willing to upfront the cost of the labor cost to create a podcast that has a long-term result on that investment. Now, I'm not going to tell you how to get started with a podcast. You can go online and look up all the different tools that are available. Getting it listed on iTunes. There's a million articles for that. All I'm trying to communicate to you today is it a good idea for you to start one? Well, let me tell you a little bit about the podcasts that I've helped people manage in the past. You should be ready and willing to spend at least $1,000 a month on labor, okay? Which over a course of a year is $12,000 in a year. That's just on labor. So I'm talking about planning, getting in contact with podcast guests. I'm talking about sitting down. Either if you're only hosting it yourself, you have to factor in your time. If you're bringing in the CEO of a company, you have to factor in his time if he's the CEO of your company. If you're the founder of your company, you have to imagine what is the cost of your time that you're putting into this podcast when you could maybe be doing something like sales. So you have to imagine, I'm talking at least $1,000 a month is the labor cost that you should expect to spend on a podcast. Editing, okay? So now I just mentioned to you, like the labor cost of hosting it and the labor cost of planning it, but then consider the labor cost of editing. It takes a long time to edit, a podcast, to cut out those mistakes, maybe to add some extra dynamic music and things like that, sound effects, all those things that are like, this podcast is hosted by whatever, all of that stuff, plus the calls to action that you put at the end. It's a big investment, okay? The reason I'm sharing this video with you is because I don't want you to get the wrong idea and think that I can just go start a podcast tomorrow and it's going to be a huge success. Now, I've run podcasts for organizations where we got all the way up to over 100 episodes. Those podcasts were stinking successful because we had a blog already, we had a video channel already, and we augmented that with a podcast. We already had an actively engaged audience, some portion of which required an additional way to engage with our brand. Now, after 100 podcasts, we had so many subscribers that people were listening to our podcast many times throughout the day. We had many different people listening to that podcast. And we could find that directly from that podcast, we saw a bump that had increased in our revenue for that company that we did this for. That is a long-term goal of hosting a podcast. Now, I've also helped companies put together podcasts that only lasted a short period of time. And why? Because at the end of that process, they realized, like, holy smokes, man, we've spent $6,000-7,000 over the past 6 or 8 months developing this podcast, going into labor costs, going into hosting costs, all of that kind of stuff. The time that it takes to get distribution on different websites, it's a task. And they decided we have to shut it down because our product is only worth $200 a month to us. We're not getting enough return on it. Strongly consider, what is the value of your product? Will it be worth it to you to create a long-term venture like a podcast? How much time are you willing to wait to see the return on your investment? And then you can determine if that's right for you. Now, before I go, I want to give you one last very, very important piece of information when hosting a podcast. You must find a way to get influencers involved with your podcast. Here's why. When you start it, and I can swear on this, okay? You can hold me accountable to this. When you start your podcast, there will not be many people who subscribe or who even listen to your podcast for a period of time. I mean, I'm gonna say like 6 months. You're not gonna get that many people organically that find it because now there's like some 50,000 podcasts on iTunes. So just finding your podcast will be a task for the normal human being unless they know the name and they search for it. Now you can promote it. You can promote it on your own Twitter page. You can promote it through your own Facebook and even your own email list. If you send a newsletter, I would recommend that you include a link to your new podcast, once every now and then in your newsletter. That would be a great way to tell people about it. But even still, after 5 or 6 months, you will still not have that many people subscribe to it. Not enough that you'll be sitting there thinking, wow, this was really worth it. It just doesn't happen that fast. But if you pull in influencers, somebody who maybe has 100,000 followers on Twitter, who you invite to become a guest of that podcast. Then once that show is finished, that influencer shares the link to the podcast with their audience. Now you've just opened up a doorway to speak to 100,000 new people who may have never seen you before. You got an Instagram influencer who has 1 million. Maybe it's the author of a book. Maybe it's someone like Tim Ferriss, okay? Like tons and tons and tons of followers on Instagram. Get somebody like that on your podcast and either encourage him to, or okay, sorry Tim Ferriss if you watch this. Okay, I'm not saying people are going to buy you. I'm using you as an example. Some influencers you have to buy. You have to pay them something to share the information. Some influencers you just have to kind of encourage a little bit to do it. Some people just need a little bit of a push. But in any case, you get that person involved, okay, in your podcast, and then you encourage them to share that out to their audience. If you want it to be successful, you have to do this. Take a look at some more information on my website. I'm going to leave some links down below. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions about starting your own podcast, please do connect with me. I'd be happy to answer your questions. I'm not that far away. So good luck. Good luck with your plans. Good luck with your first few episodes. And I'll see you soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.